Hello there, Drew Hanish, Whiskey Lore, holding in my hand another Beam Suntory product that I would love to see be a lot better than it is. I'll pour a little more in my glass here. This is Old Overholt. This is a bottled in bond, 100 proof. Let me tell you what I love about this whiskey. I love that on the packaging it talks about being non-chill filtered, saying to give the whiskey a richer, fuller flavor. In cold temperatures, the whiskey may appear cloudy or have visible particles, which is both normal and natural. That is where I love it. After that, let's jump into it. So, Old Overholt, the reason why I love this whiskey in concept is that this is really the whiskey that carried through and kept rye whiskey alive. So, the brand was established in 1888, Old Overholt. Prior to that, it was Overholt, I guess. And I'm going to have Laura Fields on in the future on the podcast, and we're going to talk a lot about Pennsylvania rye and the history of Pennsylvania distilling, because like Indiana, like Tennessee, there's a long history that is fascinating, and I really want to dive into that. But this brand was basically, as I understand, Old Overholt. The name came around 1888. Now, it claims to be the oldest brand in America for whiskey, saying 1810, which is when Abraham Overholtzer was starting it up as a company, but I'm not sure what the name of the whiskey was at that time. It was being put into barrels. This is the hard part about brands from these early 19th century distillers, is that, well, they may have stamped it onto a barrel, but they weren't putting it in bottles at that time. Bottles are a late 19th century addition to whiskey. I won't say invention, because there's a possibility they were putting whiskey in bottles before then, but it was really expensive to do, and it was not something that they were mass merchandising at that time. And Abraham had actually taken over the distillery from his father Henry, who's German. And this is where we need to change the story on whiskey in America, because so many times we are told, because of Kentucky and Tennessee, that it's the Scots-Irish that brought distilling to America. And that is so not 100% the case. Pennsylvania was distilling rye because it was a readily available grain, but also because there's a lot of Germans who migrated and immigrated into Pennsylvania. And in Germany, rye is a grain that has been used for whiskey for a long time. So it was just a natural move for them to all of a sudden start distilling rye whiskey, because there was corn available. They could have used corn. And so, again, this will be interesting to talk to Laura Fields about this, because she's doing extensive research into Pennsylvania distilling and trying to get that whole story out. And I kind of have the Tennessee angle. And of course, we talked to Alan Bishop from Spirits of French Lick about Indiana's background. All of this surrounding Kentucky, Kentucky being the gold standard of producing historical information about their distilling and being very proud of it. So, but I think as Americans, we need to look beyond and know that there was distilling going on in New York, New England, Virginia, and it wasn't all corn whiskey. There was a lot of rye whiskey, especially in the early years, where rye was America's spirit, up until bourbon kind of took that moniker, because Pennsylvania and Indiana and Tennessee had basically had remnants of prohibition that were keeping them from really promoting where they were in terms of American whiskey. So this sells itself as a whiskey that was born in Pennsylvania and made in Kentucky. Around Prohibition is where, in fact, in the middle of Prohibition, is where national distillers came in, a remnant of the Whiskey Trust, and bought up the Old Overholt brand. And then it wasn't until 1987 that Jim Beam acquired the name and ended up moving the distillery to Kentucky, or the distilling to Kentucky. And so it's been made in Kentucky ever since then. And like Old Crow, this is a brand that I would love to see be revered with great quality products in it. That it is not a bottom shelf product. It is at least a mid shelf, if not a top shelf whiskey. But we all know where Old Crow is. It's basically watered down Jim Beam stuck at the bottom shelf. And honestly, I have a bottle of Old Crow just for historical purposes, and I don't touch it because it's just not. It's drinkable, you know? I mean, if you're getting into bourbon and you're scared of bourbon and you don't want to have something that's too aggressive, then, you know, have all the Old Crow you want. It's not going to bother you, and it's going to deliver the alcohol. It's still 80 proof, but in the case of Old Overholt, and there's some different variations in terms of the proof on this, I wouldn't go any lower than the bottled in bond, because to me the bottled in bond at least is delivering enough in terms of quality and flavor. I can't imagine what a lower proof of this is going to be like. And from a historical standpoint, Old Overholt was one of the first whiskeys to fit under the Bottled in Bond Act. So there's historical precedent for it. So again, I revere it from that standpoint. But I hate to say this, but when it comes to Heaven Hill buying up all of these old names like Henry McKenna and J.W. Dance and so on and so forth, at least Heaven Hill is putting in some really nice product into those inexpensive whiskeys. JTS Brown, we can go on with a list of all the names that they're hoarding over there at Heaven Hill. Beam Suntory, come on. You have the greatest name in the 19th century for whiskey, Old Crow, and what are you doing with it? And Old Overholt, same way. Rye whiskey, we're talking about a name that has basically held rye on the market through a time when rye whiskey just about disappeared 100% from the American market. So we need to be proud of these brands. We need to put something more into these bottles than just something to get by and say, this is for your consumer who really isn't a whiskey drinker, but they want to have a whiskey bottle around. And so this is approachable enough for them, but it's not going to win an award. It's definitely not going to impress anybody. It's just there as something to drink or to get a buzz off of it, or whatever the situation is. So you can tell I nosed and tasted this before because I've had this bottle around for a while. I have a lot of rye, and this is not a rye that I ever feel compelled to go pick up. I see the label, I say I want to, but unfortunately it continues to sit there because when I first tasted it, I just remembered that it didn't have a lot of personality to it for a rye fan. For a person who wants to maybe get into drinking whiskey, then maybe we found the entry point by jumping on this. And impressive to see bottled in bond, non-chill filtered, great. You're making some really excellent steps with this whiskey. But I can't imagine that Old Overholt in 1888 would be anywhere close to what is in this glass right here. So the nose is very light. It causes you to have to breathe in a little harder, which gets some of that alcohol vapor to hit your nostrils, but it's not overly aggressive, actually. So it's a well-distilled spirit from that standpoint. But for the rye fan, there's just not a lot going on. It's just like a light, sweet, floral rye along with that vanilla, and that's about all you're getting on the nose. Cheers. Lemon, little pepper, rye is there. I get caramel, maybe a little fruity note, slight Kentucky hug. It's telling me it has corn in it. They don't give us the mash bill. We have no idea what's in this. But I would assume that it does have a decent amount of corn in it. I don't think it's like Rittenhouse where it's, basically 51% rye and then corn is like 30-something%. Maybe a little lower than that because the hug is there, but it's not overly aggressive. Little lemon note in it. It lingers slightly on the finish, but it goes away pretty quickly. Touch of a char note in there as well. It is a very drinkable whiskey, and I would say that if you are hanging out with friends, having a bottle of this around, especially if your friends are not normally straight whiskey drinkers, and you want to, have them get into drinking it, maybe they'll like it. Little iced tea note there. Yeah, a little black tea note coming in. But for a rye fan, no. I'd keep it around for nostalgia, but other than that, I don't think it's going to knock anybody's socks off in terms of being a great rye whiskey. It's just a well-made, inexpensive entry to rye, and even at that, it sort of fails a little bit because there's not enough rye character in there for me to really say. I've had bourbons that have a lot more rye character to them than this rye does, and so from that standpoint, gotta say, a little disappointed in it, but I love the fact that they're non-chill filtering. I love the fact that they're bringing and keeping alive a historic brand, but I feel like, again, like Old Crow, and I will say this, Old Crow, I won't ever buy it again. I not until they make a drastic change in what it is. This is drinkable. This is something that I'm not embarrassed to have around. So in that case, I would say, there's your difference. Yes, I would keep a bottle of this around. Probably won't. Old Crow, once that bottle's gone, I'm not buying it again. It's just actually kind of embarrassing for what Old Crow should be versus what it is. So, I mean, I have tasted older Old Crows, and they are much better. They have some weaknesses, but they are much more flavorful. I would love to taste an Old Overholt from pre-Prohibition and see what that tasted like, because I have a feeling it would be much more rye forward than this particular whiskey is. Anyway, that's what I got to say about it. What do you think about Old Overholt? What do you think about these old names being bought up, and should there be more of a reverence for them? Should these large corporate distillers be paying a lot more attention and really, paying homage to these brands instead of just trying to use them as labels that are familiar and selling a legacy that the whiskey inside really doesn't honor, I would say. And I know that's harsh, and I try not to be harsh about things, but I am passionate about these old labels, and I would love to see them be honored a lot more than they are. So anyway, leave your comments below. Give me a like if you enjoyed the video. And until next time, cheers and slanjava. There's nothing offensive about it. I'm trying to think of a musical group that it's Journey. I don't know. It's probably no, because Journey's got some good meaty songs. What is just like an average band? Leave those mentions below too. It's like an average band that, yeah, they put out good stuff, but nobody really says they're like the Jay Giles band. This is the Jay Giles band. I mean, they put out good music, but honestly, who runs around saying they're a Jay Giles band fan? Or Steve Miller. I used to say that about Steve Miller. Steve Miller is a great band. They have some really great music, but there's not a lot of people running around saying that my favorite band in the world is the Steve Miller band. They're just a good band. They do what they do. They have some great music, but they're nobody's number one favorite. They're like number 25 on everybody's list kind of thing. So anyway, that's kind of where we're at with Old Overholt. Hope that helped. Anyway.